So I was looking at a map of the Florida Panhandle earlier, just staring at the coast, and you see Panama City right there on the bay. It's the county seat. It's got the port. It's just the big dot on the map. It feels so inevitable. Like, of course that's where the city is.
And that is exactly what its founders wanted you to think. It's kind of the ultimate magic trick of city planning, really. But if you rewind the clock, say, 120 years, that dot didn't exist.
Right.
Instead, you had this completely different dynamic. You had three ferocious rivals all sitting on the same bay, basically just staring each other down.
Like a standoff, but with, sawmills and schooners instead of guns.
Exactly. It was not one big happy community.
Yeah.
You had St. Andrews, which was this old historic maritime village. You had Millville, the industrial powerhouse.
Okay.
And then you had this scrappy upstart in the middle that, and this is my favorite part of the research, literally changed its name to trick people in Chicago into giving them money.
I love a good scam. Or, a branding strategy.
Let's call it aggressive marketing. But yeah, today's deep dive is all about how that marketing scheme, plus a really ruthless political move in 1926, effectively wiped two cities off the map to create the greater Panama City we know today.
We are talking about the annexation of 1926.
We are. It's a story about this tension between organic growth cities that just happen and this kind of manufactured ambition. And to understand why some locals are still a little salty about it, you have to meet the players.
Because before they were neighborhoods, they were actual towns.
Sovereign towns with very, very different vibes.
All right, let's unpack the roster then. First up, the old town St. Andrews.
Right. If you were around in the late 1800s, St. Andrews was the only place that really mattered. Its lineage goes all the way back to Spanish navigators. It was settled permanently in 1827 by a former governor of Georgia, John Clark.
So it had some serious pedigree from day one. It wasn't just like a random fishing shack.
Oh, massive pedigree. And it was built entirely around the water. The sources, they highlight something really interesting about the Civil War here. St. Andrews was crucial to the Confederacy, not for guns or soldiers, but for salt.
Salt.
Yes, salt. It sounds so mundane now, but back then in the 1860s, salt was strategic. It was the only way you could preserve meat for an army.
Right, for rations.
Exactly. And St. Andrews Bay had this 3-year drought during the war, which made the water extra salty, perfect conditions.
So they were basically farming salt out of the bay.
Thousands of bushels a day. It got so critical that the Union Navy actually sailed in and burned the town to the ground in 1863 just to stop the salt works.
That is a wild detail. We have to stop the salt.
But the town bounced back, and by the turn of the century, St. Andrews had sort of evolved. It went from industrial salt to sea baths.
Sea baths. Okay, is that just a fancy way of saying swimming?
Pretty much, yeah, but with a health tourism spin on it. It was the spa day of 1900. Wealthy people would come down for the restorative waters. It was a walkable, charming little village.
A leisure economy.
Totally. And here's the key part. Its lifeline wasn't a road. It was a ship. The SS Tarpon.
The legendary Tarpon. That name popped up so many times in the notes.
It's an icon. The Tarpon brought everything, the mail, the flour, the beer, the tourists. St. Andrews was historic, romantic, and completely reliant on the water. It faced the Gulf, not the mainland.
Okay, so that's player one. The classy, old-school waterfront town. Player two sounds like the complete opposite. Let's talk about Millville.
A night and day difference. If St. Andrews was leisure, Millville was labor. It was born from the pine forests, founded in the 1880s by a French-Canadian guy, Henry Bovis, over on Watson Bayou.
And what surprised me in the data is just the scale of it. I think you assume Panama City was always the big one, but the notes say that in 1910, Millville was actually the largest community on the bay.
It was, by a lot. It was the industrial engine, it had the people and the tax base because it had the jobs, and the crown jewel of that whole economy was the German-American Lumber Company.
Now, this is one of those details that just stops you in your tracks. German-American in the early 1900s isn't just a name, is it?
No, it was. It was quite literal. The German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, actually owned stock in this lumber mill in the Florida Panhandle.
Wait, hold on. The Kaiser? Like World War I, we're fighting against this guy Kaiser.
The very same one. He owned a piece of a lumber mill in Millville, Florida. So when World War I broke out, this became a massive issue. The U.S. government seized the mill.
I bet. What did they find?
They found arms and pro-German literature on site.
That's insane. So they really thought it was some kind of spy hub.
There was a legitimate suspicion of espionage, yeah. So, contrast that with St. Andrews. You've got this historic, salty resort town on one side. Then you've got Millville, massive, gritty, blue-collar, and, oh yeah, maybe harboring German spies.
And then you have player number 3, the one that eventually ate the other 2.
The newcomer. And originally it was just this tiny hamlet called Harrison.
Harrison doesn't exactly scream international gateway.
It didn't, and that was its whole problem. But Harrison had one thing the other 2 towns didn't have: geography. It was just perfectly situated for a railroad terminus.
Ah, the railroad.
St. Andrews was too built up. Millville was too marshy in spots. Harrison was just a blank slate in the perfect spot.
And this is where our main character walks on stage. The man with the plan.
George Mortimer West. He's the architect of this whole drama. A railroad man, a publisher, a promoter. He understood something very modern, that towns aren't just built, they're sold.
And Harrison wasn't a product that was moving off the shelves.
Not at all. So in 1906, Wes and his partners, guys like A.B. Steele, they knew they needed a rebrand. And at that exact moment, the biggest news story in the world was the Panama Canal.
Oh, I see where this is going. This is the audacious part.
It is a pure branding stunt. They looked at a map, they took out a ruler, and they drew a straight line from Chicago down to the Panama Canal. And they claimed that their little town of Harrison fell directly on that line.
So they just renamed it Panama City.
They did. They told all the traders in Chicago, look, we are the most direct American gateway to the Panama Canal. It implied this destiny that was just completely made up. They were selling a shortcut.
It worked.
It worked because it justified the infrastructure. A.B. Steele gets the Bay Line Railroad finished in 1908, and that's the turning point. St. Andrews had deep water for ships, sure, but Panama City now had the steel rails connecting north.
That just changes the physics of the entire economy.
Completely. If you wanted to ship your lumber or your turpentine to Atlanta or Chicago, you suddenly had to go through Panama City. The railroad made St. Andrews' deep water less important overnight.
So Panama City starts to boom, fueled by this railroad money and this very clever branding. But St. Andrews and Millville are still independent cities, right? With their own mayors and everything.
Exactly. For a while, that was fine. But then you hit the 1920s. The Florida land boom is just going nuts. There's this mania for bigness all over the country.
Everybody wants to be a metropolis.
And Panama City had a ceiling. It was growing, sure, but the Bay was fragmented. You had 3 different town councils, 3 tax structures.
Which makes it really hard to get the big bucks from Washington, D.C.
Precisely. They wanted federal money to dredge the harbor, to make it a world-class port to match that fancy name. But Washington would look at them and just see 3 little squabbling villages. Not a regional power.
So the solution is assimilation.
The solution was Greater Panama City. The business elites argued that to compete on a global scale, they needed to be one unified front. They needed Millville's industrial base and St. Andrews' deep water all under one flag.
I can't imagine St. Andrews and Millville were exactly thrilled about just handing over the keys to the kingdom.
There was major resistance. You have to remember, St. Andrews saw itself as the cultured, historic heart of the Bay, becoming a neighborhood of this upstart railroad town. It was insulting. It's like London being annexed by a suburb.
But the political machine in Panama City was just too strong.
It was ruthless. On March 12, 1926, the hammer comes down. St. Andrews and Millville are formally annexed. Their municipal governments are just dissolved.
Just like that.
Gone with the stroke of a pen.
And this is where the story gets really personal and kind of strange. We keep talking about George West, the guy who named Panama City, who hyped it up in his newspaper.
The architect.
Guess where he lived?
And that's the paradox, isn't it? He lived in St. Andrews. He loved the old town. He lived in that historic, walkable place while he was building the industrial machine that was about to swallow it whole.
That's a serious conflict of interest, or at least a conflict of the heart.
It was, and the sources suggest it caused real tension in his family. His wife, Lillian West, who's a fascinating figure herself, a suffragette, a civic leader, she was apparently very opposed to the final terms of the annexation.
She saw the writing on the wall.
She was afraid St. Andrews would lose its soul, its identity. And she wasn't wrong. Later on, she actually ran the publishing company and became this huge voice for community preservation. She really represented the resident view against her husband's industrialist view.
What a dynamic. The man building the future versus the woman trying to save the soul of the place. So, okay, 1926 happens. The merger is done. Did the gamble pay off for them?
In purely economic terms, absolutely. The consolidation worked. By presenting that unified front, they attracted huge players. International Paper opened a massive mill in 1931.
Which is a huge deal during the Great Depression.
Oh, it's jobs, money, stability. Then World War II comes along, and that's the real clincher. Because they were a single entity with rail and deep water, they landed the Wainwright shipyard. They built Liberty ships for the war effort. Panama City became an industrial powerhouse.
So Panama City wins. The brand becomes reality. But what's the cost? What happened to St. Andrews and Millville after they lost their independence?
This is what you might call the hollowing out phase. Let's take St. Andrews. Once all the port development focused on the Panama City docks, it just lost its commercial reason to be. The rail spur that went there was eventually abandoned.
So the commerce just dried up.
It shifted east. St. Andrews went from being a bustling port to just a neglected neighborhood. For decades, it really struggled. It became the place that time forgot.
And Millville?
A different but maybe tougher fate. It stayed industrial, the paper mill was right there, but it lost its political voice. It became a company neighborhood. It got all the pollution and the noise from industry, but it had no local council to stand up for itself or tax the companies for its own benefit.
So all of the burden, none of the control.
That's a good way to put it. There's this staggering statistic in one of the sources. By 2004, the average age of a building in Millville was 56 years old. That just screams long-term stagnation. And then in 2022, the paper mill finally closed.
The end of an era.
Truly. That mill was the entire economic reason the annexation was pushed through. So now Millville is trying to figure out what it even is without that engine.
It's interesting, though, because lately there's been a bit of a turn, right? St. Andrews especially seems to have found a new identity.
It has. And the irony is just perfect. It's thriving because of the very things that made it obsolete in 1926. It's walkable, it has historic charm, it's on the water.
The things the railroad men didn't care about are the things that tourists and, well, people now really value.
Exactly. The creation of what they call community redevelopment areas, or CRAs, has tried to fix that hollowing out. And St. Andrews has reinvented itself as this funky, independent, salty village. It's where you go for good food and art, not to load cargo.
It's like the original identity just went underground for a while and waited it out.
It did. St. Andrews stayed salty in spirit. And Millville is trying to do the same now, to embrace its blue-collar grit, its history on the working waterfront. It's a harder road for them, but they're trying.
So when you look at the whole big picture, George West and his friends, they wanted efficiency, they wanted a global port, and they got it. You can't argue that those ships they built helped win World War II.
No, you can't. The annexation absolutely created a regional economic engine. It worked. But the question you have to ask is, was the trade-off worth it? George West built a city to connect with the world, that straight line to the Panama Canal, but in doing so, he disconnected these local towns from their own governance, from themselves.
He traded identity for efficiency.
And we are still seeing the ripples of that trade today. The decades of neglect those neighborhoods suffered was the price paid for the port of Panama City. It took almost 80 years for St. Andrews to really find its footing again.
It makes you wonder, when you look at your own city, what little villages got eaten to make the map look so clean and simple?
Every metropolis is just a graveyard of smaller towns, if you look close enough.
A cheerful thought to end on. But really, it's a great reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a hostile takeover.
Happy to provide the grim context.
Well, that's all for this deep dive into the making of Panama City. Next time you're driving through, maybe take a detour. Go find the old town.
And watch out for the ghost of the tarpon.
We'll see you next time.